Alright, welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. Today I have the real deal, that 30 GPU Destiny 2 benchmark for you. Now for testing, we're obviously using the beta version of Destiny 2, and access was granted on August 29th for those that pre-ordered the game. The retail release won't be until late October, so in a few months' time, but even so, it was great to take a peek at what we're in for. Both AMD and Nvidia have released updated drivers to better support Destiny 2, and they did this about a week ahead of the PC Open Beta, and I found performance was excellent on both the Radeon and GeForce GPUs, as you're about to see. For testing, I have again used our Core i7 7700K GPU test system, and that is again clocked at 4.9 GHz, but I also found the game played very well on much more affordable CPUs such as the Pentium G4560 and Ryzen 3 1200, for example. If you missed yesterday's What Does It Take to Play video, which was based on Destiny 2, then let me just quickly say that with the GeForce GTX 1060, we found the game played exceptionally well using AMD's Ryzen 3 1200, and that was without needing to overclock the CPU. I've also looked at the Ryzen 5 1600, and we will compare those numbers to the mighty Core i7 7700K later in the video. For now, we do have 30 GPUs to focus on, 17 of which are from the current generation lineup, with another 13 from last season's lineup. All have been tested at the 1080p, 1440p and 4K resolutions using the high quality preset, which is the second highest quality preset available in the game. Right now, the highest quality preset, which is called highest, completely smashes performance. Visually, I didn't really notice a huge difference between the high and highest quality presets, so for that reason I've decided to go for high for now, and this means that SMAA is the anti-aliasing method of choice. Since you can't save your progress during the beta, it's like a single play tutorial style intro, I've tested the first 60 seconds from the very start, and I'll show you what the pass looks like now. Having done this over 90 times now, I have it pretty well memorized. Testing this game though was a massive pain. I had to exit after every single run to reset everything. It was insanely time consuming, as you can probably imagine. I do hope that when the game is finally released, we can find a significantly more efficient method to test. For now, I haven't tested the multiplayer section of the game, mostly because I found getting into a game took way too long, so I abandoned that plan pretty early on. Anyway, let's watch the rest of the benchmark pass, and then we'll get down to business as we have a lot of data to go over.
Zavala's doing the hero thing in the plaza. Me? I've got a date with whoever's behind this. It'll be a short date.
Over here, Titan. My armory is open to you. Follow the path from there. It will lead you through the hangar to the plaza. I'll take care.
First up, we have the old boys, the GeForce 900 series, along with the Radeon 300 and Fury series. Testing at 1080p, we see that most of the previous generation GPUs had no trouble maintaining well over 60 FPS at all times, as demonstrated by the Radeon R9 390 and GeForce GTX 970. Even the R9 380 and GTX 960 do well, averaging over 60 FPS. It's interesting to see that the Fury series was not really able to pull ahead of the R9 390X, and in fact trailed the GTX 980, and it got completely stomped by the GTX 980 Ti. Fine wine ain't working here. Moving on to 1440p, the Fury X series does start to recover, though even here the Fury X is still down on the GTX 980 Ti. Meanwhile, the GTX 970 edged ahead of the R9 390, though it has to be said both did provide exceptionally smooth frame rates. In fact, quite shockingly, even the GeForce GTX 950 managed to keep frame rates above 30 FPS for a slightly console-ish feel, I suppose, though the graphics and resolution were considerably better. Then finally, for the previous gen GPUs, we tested at 4K, and as expected, you'll ideally want a previous generation flagship part such as the GTX 980 Ti or Fury X for playing at this resolution. The mid-range to high-end models such as the GTX 970 and R9 390 did well, but again, you'll probably want more horsepower for 4K gaming. Okay, so what about the current generation GPUs? Yeah, there's quite a lot of them now. AMD might be lacking a truly high-end GPU, but they're still pretty competitive in overall numbers. Ignoring the high-end stuff for now, as we are only at 1080p, we find that to keep the frame rates above 60 FPS at all times, gamers will require an RX 570 or GTX 1060 3GB, and frankly, those are some pretty mild demands. For now though, Nvidia does have a clear advantage in this title, at least at these lower resolutions, and we see this when comparing GPUs such as the RX 580 and GTX 1060 for example. Moving on, as we increase the resolution to 1440p, this greatly reduces the margins between the AMD and Nvidia GPUs, and we now just see 3 frames standing between the GTX 1060 and RX 580, both of which provided excellent performance at this reasonably high resolution. For an average of around 100 FPS, you will want to seek out a GTX 1070 or Vega 56 GPU, and for going well beyond 100 FPS, you will of course require a GTX 1080 Ti. And finally, if you want to enjoy Destiny 2 in all of its glory at 4K, then get your wallets out and prepare to empty them. Actually, it's probably not really that bad, and in fact the GTX 1080 actually does very well here. Of course, the 1080 Ti was much smoother thanks to a 33% increase in frame rates, and it did push well over 60 FPS at all times, but still the game appears very well optimized. Before wrapping things up, as usual, I have this giant mess for you to try and decipher with a magnifying glass. For easier to digest versions of this very graph, head over to TechSpot. I'll provide the link in the video description. Anyway, here are all 30 GPUs compared at 1080p, and as you can see, there are a number of options capable of delivering between 96 and 105 FPS on average, and that being the case, there are a great deal of GPUs that are good for 60 FPS plus. We do see a wider spread of results at 1440p, and again, there are a huge amount of GPUs capable of pushing over 60 FPS. That said though, those seeking 100 FPS or greater will either need to back the quality settings down or opt for a very high-end GPU. And finally, we again have the 4K results. With the high quality preset enabled, if you want to average around 60 FPS, your options are admittedly quite limited. The best value choice here is quite clearly the GTX 1080, but damn, the Ti version was very nice in this title at 4K. Just lastly, before wrapping things up, I did throw in the GTX 1080 Ti on both the 7700K and Ryzen 5 1600 test systems to see how they compare. Now, these results are only from the first 60 seconds of the single player campaign, and I am aware that larger open sections of the game as well as the multiplayer modes will likely be more CPU demanding, but until the game is officially released I can't really test that, so for now this will have to do. As expected, at 4K we run into a massive GPU bottleneck and performance is much the same, though the 7700K did still maintain a better 1% low result. Moving to 1440p, the Intel CPU did offer a 15% greater performance margin, and this was blown out to 27% at 1080p. Utilization was good on both CPUs, and the game did evenly distribute load across all the R5 1600's cores. It just didn't give it enough work to warrant having all those extra cores for this title. At least under the conditions we tested, as I noted. Anyway, on that note, expect a much more in-depth Destiny 2 CPU benchmark once the game is officially released. Well, I have to say, although I haven't had a chance to check out the multiplayer portion of the game yet, I was pleasantly surprised by what I found in the single-player experience. The game looks great, plays well, and for a beta, I have to say it's significantly more polished than most of the AAA titles I tested last year, so hats off to the developer. For an enjoyable single-player experience, a mid-range GPU will have you more than covered at 1080p using the high-quality settings, and many will provide a very smooth 60 FPS experience even at 1440p. The AMD GPUs are lagging a little bit behind at 1080p, but I have to say they do come alive at 1440p and 4K, and here they were very competitive. Speaking of 4K, did you see the GTX 970 going toe-to-toe with the R9 390, spitting at 37 FPS on average? I don't recall exactly what time it was meant to be, but wasn't the 970 with its measly 3.5GB frame buffer meant to be completely obsolete by now, and, well, pretty much just a heap of rubbish? Maybe I got my dates mixed up. Anyway, the extremely popular Maxwell-based GPU is still trucking along just fine as far as we can tell. Of course, so too is the R9 390 and its never die attitude. Further down the food chain though, the R9 380 is quite simply having its way with the GTX 960, though it does go the other way when looking at the GTX 950, and R7 370 as Nvidia quite easily wins that battle. Then at the complete opposite end of the spectrum we have the GTX 980 Ti, and once again it proved to be just far too much for the Fury X. As for the current generation GPUs, if you're lucky enough to own a GTX 1060 or RX 580, then you look set to take full advantage of what Destiny 2 has to offer. For the single player portion of the game, as long as you have a CPU that's better than say an FX series or an old Core i3 for example, then you're going to be right. All of the Ryzen CPUs do very well in this title, as do Intel's newer dual-core CPUs supporting hyperthreading, so the Pentium G4560 for example. Through my brief testing, I did notice that the newer Core i3s will see utilization hovering around, say, 80%, and this is also true for the Pentium G4560. Meanwhile, the Ryzen 3 1200 was more like 60 to 70%, and the Ryzen 5 1400 was really only loaded up to, say, about 50%. Then when it comes to memory, we were only seeing around 2.3 gigabytes of VRAM allocated at 1440p, and this explains why the 3GB GTX 1060 does so well, along with the GTX 970. Even at 4K, we're only starting to get to the limits of the 3GB buffer, but of course these GPUs run out of processing power before the memory capacity becomes an issue. As for the system memory, or RAM, it looks like 8GB will have you covered. Destiny 2 sucks up around 5 to 6GB, at least it did for this beta version. Overall, I found Destiny 2 to be a very fun and great looking game that appears very well optimised for the PC. I'm now keener than ever to get my hands on the full retail version, not only to enjoy it and play it, but also for some more in-depth benchmarks, of course. Hopefully, though, these benchmark results of the beta version give you a good idea of how your PC will perform in this upcoming title. Speaking of which, if your PC is in need of an upgrade to play Destiny 2, then perhaps you should check out our new Upgrade My PC Please series. I'll provide a link in the video description below. That's it for this one, guys. I'm your host, Steve. See you again soon.